Okay, so we're going to be in Genesis 22 today. So go ahead and be turning there. Yeah, Genesis 22. And if you turn there, I want to put forward this question. And the question is what is the difference, or is there a difference between the providence of God, or the providences of God, and the promise or promises of God? What's the difference between the providences of God and the promises of God?
What's providence?
Providence is everything that happens that God uses for his purpose and his plans.
Is providing.
Yep, it's providing. Right? So what is the difference there?
So what is the difference between providing and promises?
Yeah. We're looking at that today. So before I segue into that, the providences of God are the means in which he accomplishes his promises. When we lose sight of God's providence and only look at the promise, so we start getting into trouble. Like think of the example of Ishmael. God gets the promise, or Abraham gets the promise. When you get a son, he doesn't get there in time for Abraham, and he leaps ahead of God's providence, and he tries to interfere. He takes Hagar, gets Ishmael out of it. So that's what happens when you sort of separate the providence of God from the promises of God. But if you keep those things together, even when the promises fail, or seem to fail at least, you get a holy character. I think about Job, in Job 1, after everything went bad for Job. Job 1, verse 20 says, Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down on the ground and worshipped. Verse 21, it said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And all this Job sinned not or charged God foolishly. So that is when you are trusting to God, and you're trusting to God's character and his provision that he offers you. Anyway.
I don't want to interrupt, but I do want to say this to answer the question you proposed.
Yeah.
The difference between providence and promise. Providence is where he came from.
Yeah.
Providence is what he is, and who he was, and why he is, and all that other stuff. The promises are made in retrospect to the providence.
Yeah.
So you can't make promises and go against who he is.
Yeah, that is we ground ourselves in the character of God, and that's what we want to talk about today. This is the third week in our section titled the Patriarchs, the Formation of Israel. I just want to briefly just talk about that, and we'll get back to providence and promises and all that in a minute. But just briefly recap what has brought us up to this point. We addressed way at the start of this section the necessity of the seed that was to come through Abraham, and the seed referring to the offspring, to the children. And that immediately will be Isaac, but its ultimate fulfillment is Jesus. Galatians 3:16, Paul tells us, Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not unto seeds as of many, but as of one. And through thy seed, which is Christ. So Christ is the ultimate fulfillment of that. We want to recall too that the seed promises go up. It goes all the way back to Genesis 3:15. The Lord tells the serpent, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Then next we talked about Abraham's worship, this exchange between Abraham and the priest king of the Most High God. This figure named Melchizedek, that was the king of Salem. We read that his name by interpretation means king of righteousness, and that the title of his king of Melchizedek, king of Salem, means king of peace. We read how that Melchizedek, or explained how Melchizedek is kind of a shorthand way of talking about the Messiah to come. But the reason that Melchizedek prefigures Christ so well is that Hebrews 7 tells us is because Melchizedek is both priest and king. He's both Lord and intercessor. He appears, as it were, without any sort of backstory, without any buildup. He is without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of the days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth the priest continually. And then from there, we moved on to the Abrahamic covenant, to the ritual, at least, involved with it. So Abraham, remember, is promised three things by God. He's promised land, he's promised a seed, and he's promised that through him, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And we saw this cutting covenant that's enacted by God. That would have been a very, very familiar custom to Abraham, but seems very strange to us. The nature of this cutting ceremony was that there was two parties, there was two people, and they would divide these animals in half, and they would walk between these butchered pieces. And there's blood, and it's just a grisly scene. And the purpose of this is it's meant to be a visible reminder of the seriousness of breaking the covenant, of the severity of breaking the covenant. And the logic went that if it was as if you were saying, be it even to me, as to these animals, if I break my covenant with you. Then what do we read next? We read that Abraham is put into a deep slumber by God. And it's God alone that is shown as the smoking furnace and a burning lamp passing between the carcasses of these split animals. This illustrates the covenant. This God makes with Abraham is a unilateral covenant. It's a one-sided covenant. Now, we can just jump ahead past the birth of Isaac, past the circumcision. That's important, but we're not going to go over that. Circumcision is the sign of the covenant. We want to go past God's command to send Ishmael away because he was causing trouble. That's the son of Sarah's handmaid, remember, into the section that I've titled Abraham's Sacrifice. And I want to read starting in verse 1, Genesis 22, starting in verse 1 through verse 18. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here am I. And he said, Take now thy son, thy only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took two of his young men with him and Isaac his son and clave wood for the burnt offering and rose up and went unto the place which God had told him. Then on the third day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto the young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. He took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, son, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there, laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, laid him on the altar upon the wood. Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place Jehovah Jireh, as is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time, and said, By myself I have sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, that only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed, as the stars of heaven, as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gates of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. Okay, that's reading 18 verses of chapter 22. And right from the start, I want us to see something, because this is very easy to get wrong. Tempt here, as the King James has it, means in the sense of temper, means in the sense of to prove. It says in verse 1, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt, or he tested Abraham. To test means to prove worthy. Moses said in Deuteronomy 8, verse 2, that the tests of God are to know what is in the heart, either to keep God's commands or to depart from them. That's the idea and the purpose of testing. There is a kind of temptation that entices, that causes spiritual defection. We can think of Satan's tempting of Eve in the garden, but that's not what we're talking about here. The tests that God gives to us always be for his glory. They'll always be for his glory and our good. The temptations of Satan, on the other hand, will always try to draw us away from God's purposes. And as we see here, Abraham passes this test with flying colors. But this is not a test to produce faith. That would be getting it sort of backwards. It's a test to reveal the faith that he already has. Abraham has been built up over time into this man of resilient and responsive faith. James tells us, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, let's say tests of various kinds, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. Abraham has had many trials in his life, and that has worked patience in him. It's produced patience in him. He has good reason to believe God. He has good reason to obey God. God has never led him astray yet in his life. And because of that, and notice first here how quickly Abraham responds when God calls to him. He says, Behold, here I am. It shows a spiritual readiness in Abraham. He's ready to be called. He's ready to be examined. He's surrendered to God. And that's good application for us this morning, because we can either respond in obedience or we can respond by evasion. Evasion is what Adam did, remember? How did Adam respond when God called for him? He hid himself. He said, I was afraid because I was naked. You see, the sinful man flees the light of God, lest his deeds be reproved. The righteous man, justified by faith, approaches the light that his deeds may be manifest that are wrought in God. Verse 2 now says, Take now thy son, thine only son, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I tell thee of. By my count, looking at this verse, there's three imperatives, three commands. Take, get, or we could say go, and offer. Take whom? Take thy son, thine only son, whom thou lovest. Go where? Go into the land of Moriah. And do what with your son? Offer him, sacrifice him as a burnt offering. If we remember back to our earlier chapters, you know that Isaac is in fact not Abraham's only son. There's Ishmael as well. That's his firstborn by natural thought, right? Before when Abraham's faith wasn't so strong, he lamented to himself, oh, that Ishmael would walk before you, God. But to God, Ishmael doesn't count. He's not the child of the promise. As far as God's covenant is concerned, Abraham has only one son. And now God here is commanding him to offer him up upon the altar. He says, take now thy son, thine only son, whom thou lovest. This is also our first mention of love in the Bible. I don't know that there's any special significance to that, but it does bring to mind this love of the Father and Son brings to mind Christ, brings to mind the sacrifice of the Son, and we'll see all that prefigured here in the story. Now, this should go without saying. What we're looking at here is a one-off. What God is asking here, we can confidently say, He'll never ask of us. That was our faith is tested and will be tested in many ways. But if you think God is telling you to offer up your child, you need to check yourself into a psych ward immediately. But really, what's so huge about this is God is asked that God is asking Abraham to do what God is asking Abraham to do makes no sense in the context of Abraham's life. Because it seems like, not just seems, God is asking Abraham to kill the promise. And this contradicts the tenor of everything that God has told Abraham to do thus far. The whole reason he even left of the Chaldees was because God had promised him a child and descendants that would fill the land of Canaan like the sand of the seashore and like the stars in the heaven. And Isaac is that child. He is the means by which that will happen. So let me say there's a huge difference between trusting the promise and trusting the promise maker. Now, don't misunderstand me. We should trust the promises of God. What I mean is that while you trust the promises of God, do not divorce those promises from the one who made them to you. If you're trusting after the promises of God rather than the one who sustains the promises, you're going to run into problems. Whatever you may think that God has for you in this life, whatever paths seem welcome, trust God first. Don't try to force God's promises. Don't try to force His provision. Abraham, as we referenced earlier, had already done this with Ishmael. It was a mess. And so he has learned, by this point, he has learned obedience. Hebrews 11:17-19 says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, whom it was said that Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, whence also he received him in a figure. What does that mean? That means that Abraham so trusted the promise maker rather than the promise that he believed God would raise up Isaac from the dead. That is some radical obedience. One commentator I read said concerning this, God does not test us to lead us into sin, but to test the quality of what we are. The proof of what we are is what we do. The proof of what we are is what we do.
We believe in the promise maker,
Yeah.
not about the promise.
Yeah.
We the promise, but
Yeah.
ultimately it's the promise maker. And so at this point, fair to say, right, that Abraham knew, hey, this is what God promised. And however he's about to do it, so Abraham knew that Isaac was the seed. He would have known that was the line. He knew Ishmael was not.
So in that sense, he knows what you're telling me to kill the line. Right? Because it has to go from Abraham to Isaac, the lineage there. And he's like, well, you literally telling me to break the line that's going to keep your promise. Okay, I'll do exactly what you say. Because I believe, even if I do kill him, you'll just raise him from the dead to keep that promise.
Yeah. Because God is faithful, right? God's character demands his faithfulness. I want to notice something else here about this as we read this passage. Notice what we do not read in this account at no point. We do not read anything. We read nothing of Abraham's feelings. I'm sure he had plenty of them. But the point that we're given in this narrative is that we walk by faith. We do not walk by our feelings. Abraham's faith was not in God's desire to stop the sacrifice, but in God's ability to raise the dead. That's the idea here.
Because wouldn't that be a natural inclination for man to say, wait a minute, but God, you said you're going to continue. Why are you going to have me kill this guy? My son, why would you do this? He never questioned. He never gave a contrast to anything. He said, okay, I'll do it.
The natural reason of man, and I would be thinking all sorts of things.
Yeah. So I say, why?
I do.
I don't get it.
Yeah, in my life, I do all the time. I know things that God intends for me by his word, and then something sort of sidetracks that, and I spend, like a whole afternoon, like praying to him about why he did this thing, instead of trusting that he will accomplish his purposes in me. As we consider this, naturally, we find child sacrifice abhorrent, and we should, because God does. But the people of Canaan, what's interesting about this is the people of Canaan would have found nothing strange in any of this. After all, the gods of the Canaanites asked for child sacrifice all the time. There was a god among them named Molech, and the Canaanites would cause their children, the Bible says, to pass through the fire, to be offered up as a burnt sacrifice. Their own children, but they would do things like bury their firstborn in the foundations of their houses as a sacrifice to their gods, so that they would have the protection of their gods or what have you.
It's a good point to make. There's try to visualize Abraham bounting his son. Because you talk about, was he pregnant time? Was his son trying to run away? What was he wishing after the this? His father, what are you trying to be at this altar of wood? Right? You're not talking about that. We try to visualize that. And then you say, well, it's kind of commonplace out to the children.
You get to know think about the Bible, I don't want her to know about everything at this point, but even against the Bible, you get to be. It's just something that happened in the world, and you say, okay.
Yeah.
I guess it's fair.
I guess it's my turn.
Yeah.
Because in verse 7, he's like, hey, Father, you got a fire started. There's wood, but where's the offering? Well, not. Where's the lamb for the offering? Usually we put a lamb here. And, oh, don't worry, son. I'll provide a bone.
When I was younger, I used to like reason like, I'm gonna just pull the ring on and let the lay down.
Take a nap.
The ring was out, like he bounced, he knows you.
Yeah, oh, yeah, it's clear at this point.
There's no trickery, it's like, this is you, and he's like, I get it. Actually, I don't know.
Yeah, that's something else too. As we get through this, is that I want you to see is that Isaac goes into this eyes wide open. Then that's a testament to his faith too, not just Abraham. But yeah, it's commonplace among the Canaanite gods. Later, we read how Israel will become corrupted by this practice. Jeremiah 19:4-5 says that God will bring evil upon Judah because of their offering up their children to Baal. And he says of that you offer up your children to Baal, you do this thing that has not even come into my mind. This is how far away child sacrifice is for God. It doesn't even come into his mind to think, to ask for you to sacrifice your child is so antithetical to God's nature. Deuteronomy 18:12 says that for all that do these things, that sacrifice their children, are an abomination unto the Lord. Leviticus 18:21 says, to do such things is to profane the name of thy God. So this is not something that the Lord saw or wanted. You read about in the scriptures. And Abraham had believed, doubtless, rightly, that Jehovah was different, that Yahweh was different. And by the end of the narrative, we see that he was fully justified in this persuasion. But right now, he's having to come to terms with this command.
Well, Isaac is trusting his dad.
Yeah.
He didn't hear us from the Lord. I mean, I'd be kind of thinking, I think Pops might have snagged a twig or something.
Prove to me God said to do this.
Yeah. I wonder if he like, I always know, you don't know, you won't about Abraham, about Abraham. I just sitting there and look at everyone. Guess what you do? He's talking to someone.
Yeah, it's a very surreal scene for sure.
Yeah.
But I think that's what it does, right? It paints the testimony and the witness of Abraham's actual faith. Like it is real. There is no question it's real. He trusts. That's the word. Trust right there.
Yeah. Let's see here. Let's go on to verse 5. It says, and Abraham said unto his young men, abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad go yonder and worship, and come again to you. This is the first use of the word worship in the Bible. It means literally something like to bow down. It's interesting that worship here for Abraham is not a time of joyful praise, of high emotions, but of surrender. Now, I think the high emotional times that we have before God in song, prayer, and preaching, I think that's wonderful. I love them. Everybody loves them. But here we see something in the heart of true worship. The heart of true worship is not to get kind of spiritual high, kind of thrill, but to humbly submit yourself to the God of heaven and earth.
It's true. A lot of what we go through right now is, looking at God and his works, his activities in retrospect.
Yeah.
So we're thankful, becoming really thankful. Abraham in this situation, and then I get how thankful he was, but he's looking in advance with the promises. Not very different. We look at promises too. We have a whole history to look back at. Well, we kept all of these all the way through here, so very different mentality.
Radically good. So Abraham, he gets up early. Wouldn't say he's eager even to obey this command. He doesn't tarry. He gets up early. Now he saddles the donkey. He takes Isaac. They see them out in the distance. They read that it's 3 days' journey. 3 days in which Isaac is as good as dead to Abraham, for all he knows. And the boy, who isn't really that young, he's probably a teenager, maybe even in his early 20s. That's what that word lad means. It doesn't really mean a child. But Isaac has the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on his shoulders, and he asked the obvious that we've already discussed. Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And I want us here to see, I think it's right to see a picture of Calvary. And we should, because this is Mount Moriah. That's in fact the Temple Mount. It's very near the place of the skull, the place of Golgotha. So it's right there in the same geographic location that the temple sacrifices will be made. And later, the ultimate sacrifice of Christ will be made.
And the father, Abraham, had his son, Isaac, carried him. Yes, his brought him in the mountain. And I thought, you know, well, like,
To your point, here's why Isaac goes into this eyes wide open. So because when you look at it, Isaac was, as he says in verse 7, behold, hey, we have the wood, we have everything else. Well, where's the land? Clearly, Isaac, this is a part of their life. We're offering animal sacrifices at this point are a normal part of Isaac's and Abraham's life. So he's very familiar with why you do burnt offerings. Isaac is, I think, it is a point. You said earlier, this is also a testament of Isaac as well. Dominated by Abraham. There's a lot of faith on Isaac's part too. I don't see any protest from Isaac.
Yeah.
Yeah, what are you doing? Okay. If you love this for a minute, can I too make the voice? You know,
I'll see that he's starting to get the picture here.
Yeah.
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 On his back and like, so.
Yeah, verse 8, verse 8, like I can kind of see Abraham just like slowly like, yeah, I will survive for them set for them. It's my son.
Yeah, you know, and
My one and only.
Yeah. Promise, yeah.
I don't know if they usually like what. Boy, I'm carrying all of it. Where's the, you know?
What are you doing?
Yeah, can I put on this on me?
Yeah.
You got it.
For donkey, I really like this donkey. We're not gonna sacrifice the donkey, right?
Got a match. Gonna sacrifice me.
Yeah, so.
I feel like this is such a document of my faith, to be totally honest with you. Like I look at this and I'm like, man, I don't have this. Like I don't.
Yeah,
Yeah. Like there's just no. Yeah. Like I'm so falling short myself because I look at this and I say, well, I don't know. Abraham wasn't a great man, like you said, right? He picked Abraham and Abraham was a pagan. And I don't know, that's such a rapid sequence of events for me to go from a pagan to abject obedience and trust.
but you know, there's what
Right here.
there's what I've lost count 30, 40 years
Yeah.
between the call and this point. So you know, 40, you know, give yourself another 40 years, you'll be all right. Yeah. But Isaac asked this question: where is the lamb for a burnt offering?
And you're right, real quick, just on Calvary, because he does say lamb there,
Yeah.
right? Who is, the Lamb of God.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, some 1900 years later, that question is answered by John the Baptist. He says in John 1:29, behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. So where is the lamb for the burnt offering? That's what Isaac asked. Abraham's response is, my son, and God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering.
this is typical of what we see in biblical prophecy. You know, how prophecy is not just about prediction and fulfillment. You see patterns through the Old Testament. So you see this come up, and then you see, lambs are already part of the deal with Melchizedek. And before he knows, we see sacrifices of lambs. And then, of course, we know the Exodus story, the Passover just started. Now, rams coming into the picture and being established. So there's this whole pattern. And Jesus, when he got toward the end of his life, he kept telling the disciples, I told you before it happens, so when it happens, you'll believe me. This is like 3 or 4 times in different scenarios. This is what God is doing here, is he's establishing this pattern of recognition for this, so they know what's happening in the time that they still don't. But that's
Yeah. Yeah, they still did, but yes. Sure. We said here already that Abraham and Isaac are in agreement. The latter half of verse 8 says that both of them met together. There's really no other conclusion that Isaac was also trusting in God's provision. Abraham would have been more than 100 years old at this point. Isaac, as we said, would have been at least a strong teenager. And he lays himself down on the altar, on the fuel for that altar. He allows himself to be bound. He watches as his father lays hold of the knife. He is fully compliant. He's fully obedient. Obedient son, laying down his life for the sacrifice. Abraham, for his part, displayed his heart towards God by not withholding his only son from God. You know, it makes me think, we've already been discussing here, it makes me think of Romans 5, 6 through 8. Paul says, when we were yet without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die. Yet, peradventure, let's say perhaps, for a good man, some would even dare to die. But God commands, he demonstrates his love towards us. And that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. You see, when God wanted to show his ultimate demonstration of his love, he did not withhold his son. This is Abraham did not withhold his son. Verse 10, Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. This ram was offered up in the place of his son. This is the first clear reference in Scripture to the idea of substitutionary atonement. First, there's other places we can kind of see it, but this is the first. Literally, you have the son on the altar. It's taken off of the altar, and this ram is put on the altar. This is the first example of innocence of an innocent lamb. Ram did nothing to deserve this death, of course, taking the place of Isaac. He's guilty. It's like we're guilty. This prefigures Christ because we needed somebody to take our place. We needed to have someone to have our guilt laid upon his shoulders. Abraham calls this place Jehovah Jireh. It's not actually what he said, but I'm not going to bother to pronounce. I think a different pronunciation. There's not a J in Hebrew. But it means the Lord will see, or the Lord will provide. It's the idea. He says, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord, it shall be seen, or we could say it shall be provided. Which is why I was asking about God's providence at the start. Abraham named it in relationship to what God did. You can think of this as like Mount Providence, Mount Provision. The praise of Abraham goes to God for his supply in this time of need. The focus for all this for Abraham is his God. We look at it and think about Abraham's faith, and that's not wrong. But when Abraham was in the midst of this, he is thinking about God, God's character, the goodness of God, the provision of God. God will provide for himself. It's the reaffirmation of the promise. Notice what the angel of the Lord says, verse 12, lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thy only son, from me. This is interesting when you actually stop and think about this. It's the angel of the Lord. We see this figure many times in the Old Testament. He says, now I know that you fear God. first person, God, third person, seeing you have not withheld your son from me. He's speaking as though he is God. God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, and he says, you've not withheld your son from me. This is the angel speaking. And it's worth asking, well, who is this angel? Now, angel can mean a created being. Most of the time, it does mean a created being. When we turn to the New Testament, that's always what it means. But in the context of the Old Testament here, angel has a sense of an office. He's a messenger. And this is what this is. Most commentators agree, I would say as well, is this is a prefigurement, pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. We know that John 1:18, Christ says, or John says, no man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who's in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. The Son has always been the way in which the Father had revealed himself to people. And we see this again and again and again, this angel of the Lord figure shows up talking to Abraham. Later, when we have Joshua, we get the captain of the Lord's army. Also, it's the same idea, same figure. But the angel says, now I know you fear God. One pastor that I read after in studying for this says, you cannot make your comprehension the measure of obedience. I think that's right. You cannot make your comprehension the measure of obedience. Abraham knew God's character. That's what he knew. He didn't comprehend the situation, but he knew God's character, and that was enough for him. That's what enabled him to have such strong faith when he was tested, by having an intimate familiarity with the goodness and character of God. He knew implicitly that his God was a God of provision, because God had demonstrated himself to be such all through Abraham's life. We said he's had 40 years of experience or so with this point. Does anybody have any questions? Do they have anything to add?
The NIV version I have here refers to message in forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Sarah dies in chapter 23. She's 127 years old. She was getting on close to 100 before she, maybe even got the promise of God. So somewhere in that pocket, in that brain, you've got Isaac. And he lives in maybe early 20s, maybe.
Mulling over the question you asked about whether in God's provision, his providence, and his promises. I think I see it as two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Because the question about a Q&A that was asked that part was, if God ordains everything, why pray? Why, if God ordains salvation, why evangelize? It's all already determined. Why do you do these things? When you look at the way God accomplishes his promises, he provides, he uses people to provide the means of keeping those promises, right? So I don't know that, I don't separate the two. I just think one is a purpose for the other.
Yeah.
I think, because when he says, God will provide himself in verse 7, he'll do everything he needs to do. But then you kind of juxtapose that against verse 18. He says, in your seed all the nations shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice.
Yeah.
It's almost like God used the faith of Abraham, obviously the faith that he would give to him, that he gave him. He would use the faith of Abraham to accomplish his promise. He provided Abraham faith, provided in the circumstance, that you're going to have. And he says, okay, through this obedience, God will now, through his providence, be able to accomplish this promise.
Yeah, that's the idea, that you cannot separate God's real providences from God's promises. They are two sides of the same coin. The problem that we can run into is when we get so caught up in God's promises that we forget God's providences, that God will provide for us. Literally, providence in the sense that He'll provide for us. And we start scheming and trying to accomplish God's promises in our own efforts.
Hence Hagar and
Against Hagar. Yeah.
So it's easier. Well, stamp on the gas pedal and run ahead.
Yeah.
And that's where trusting in the promise maker makes it. You trust in the promise maker, not solely on the promise, right? Keeping with the promise is only as good as the promise keeping ability of the promise maker. There is his security, it is. That's where Abraham goes. It's still goes back to the promise maker.
That's why when Hebrews 7, when he gets swear by no greater, he swore by himself. Thanks surely blessing, I will bless thee, etc. And so God swears by himself. There's two immutable promises. This oath of confirmation, his word, he cannot lie.
For trusting the promise, ultimately trust the promise maker.
Yeah.
The ultimate validity, that's what.
Yeah.
Certainty.
Because he's speaking of the promise, it's created. He speaks the promise into existence. So when you start to separate it, there is no separate there. He's going to do it too.
Because you can have one without the other.
Yeah.
Because that is his word, it's what creates. So when he's speaking his promises, and it's literally telling him, I'm going to do X, Y, Z.
And he's just using human means in this particular case to accomplish that.
Yeah.
That's why I was contrasting sort of the experience with Ishmael, with going into Hagar, with Job, because you see that with Job, that Job has everything ripped away from him. And all the promises, so to speak, are ripped away from him. He obviously agrees. He says he worships. He worships God. And he says, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job's whole attitude was one of trusting the promise maker. Now he complains a lot.
Because he may say, well, why?
Yeah.
Answer me.
He does do a lot of complaining, but at least in that first initial moment, you see he trusts the promise maker. Yes, my situation is dire, but the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
I think sometimes don't you want to ask the Lord too, so that is it something I did or said, since you know what to repent on, not necessarily challenging God, what are you doing here? But what's happening is something I said or did, and is my heart wrong somewhere, and I need discipline for this, or why? I think that's okay to gut check yourself.
No,
Okay, don't you want to question the Lord?
And I think that's one of the you're in the head, that the change our thinking. So what happens in our lives is these sin. I mean, initially feelings, emotion, whatever. These sin because we're like, I don't want, or I don't whatever. And so it's like, okay, God, I'm using me now here for this, and how can I then serve you? And so that repentance, like you said with Joe, I mean, initially, yes, lying, he sucks, whatever, but then like, okay, God, you're in control, you have a purpose, I need to fit myself in your purpose and not. So we let go of it, like the children, in that instance too, it's not that the kids did something, it's that God had a purpose. And so taking Job's kid away and doing and serve God, whatever it is. And don't really know when he had to align himself by the end, he aligned himself with you, right? You're God, I'm not. And then when it's wrong. And it's hard in that flash to do.
Because God never answered you. You never did an answer. Job just said, okay, I need an answer. You're right. Yeah, his answer was, I'm going.
Where were you?
Yeah. Answer's good enough, sir. Yeah, that's right. Geez.
Never mind. It's all the questions.
Yeah. Okay. We didn't see any of that with Abraham. We didn't see any of that. He didn't say, well, you know, why? Why are you doing this? He just said, okay.
It does.
Obviously, Abraham's over a line you only his way younger son that he didn't have faith that everything was all right. They overpower the situations and give away. But he was like, okay, I made up, I gotta figure out. I'm going out there. I think he didn't know what he needed. Now, right.
You're correct. Good point. Probably laid there well.
Well, I mean, it almost certainly had to be the deal right there, but I mean, it's,
I mean, he definitely probably was laying there and said, okay, now I don't think we want. You believe that?
I think he was holding them down, you know?
Yeah, I believe that the 20-year-old probably outruns something like that.
Yes.
Or I think he's probably got a pretty good.
You don't respect it, it's just talking about it. All right, so yeah.
all right, next week, we're gonna be, we'll get into Jacob and Esau. Kind of finish up Isaac's story. You know, Isaac is really more of a bridge between Abraham and Jacob and Esau than anything. I'll say something cool. But, he's sort of just a segue in the narrative. So we'll get into that next week. That's all I have for today.